All right. So today we have the founder and CEO of LastMile, Sarmad Qadri, on the podcast, and they have this interesting tagline: AI developer platform for engineering teams. They also describe themselves as prototype and productionized generative AI apps built for engineers, not just ML practitioners. So welcome to the Data Exchange podcast, Sarmad.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben. You described everything perfectly.
All right. So last mile. Let's first talk about the origin story, or actually, just a way of introducing Sarmad to the audience. So he has been a software engineer for many years. He was previously a software engineering manager at Facebook. So he comes from this with a lot of practical experience. So this is not a theoretical undertaking for him. So this is something that he has firsthand experience with. So with that said, so what inspired the founding of LastMile?
Great question. First, thank you for having me on the podcast as well. A big fan. And so it's great to now be able to speak to it too. So a couple of things. So I've worked on developer tools my entire career. I started my career at Microsoft, worked on VS Code, compilers, build systems, things like that. I wasn't actually an ML engineer. I knew very little about machine learning, but at Facebook, I got the chance to work on Jupyter Notebook platform for the company. And also, like you mentioned, I was an engineering manager and I supported a couple of teams for how Facebook ML engineers do machine learning experimentation, model management. How do you deploy models to production? There are thousands of models in production. And how do ML engineers collaborate on the same model? Ads, for example, at Facebook, there are a few models that hundreds of ML engineers work on. And so earlier this year, we saw this craze with generative AI take off. Everybody saw that. There's ChatGPT out there as a shining star of that. But what really excited me about that revolution happening was this idea that for the first time, software engineers are developing AI applications. There was always this promise of democratizing AI. And I was convinced that this was the moment that everybody had been waiting for. And so that's exactly what we've been trying to do at LastMile is what does the software engineering workflow look like for generative AI? And that's a new thing. Software engineers have not built with AI before. Many of them, if you ask them, they may not even know what Jupyter notebooks are. So really thinking through what are the pieces of ML ops that apply to data scientists and ML engineers? What are the things that software engineers are already used to? And how do we do this intersection between those two things and stitch together a new kind of developer workflow? That's what we're trying to do at LastMile. And that's the founding story. I convinced some of my favorite people at the company as well to come join me on this effort. And so it's been really fun to build the company with co-founders who were also co-workers in the past. And now we're just able to have a lot of fun in a smaller group and just really try to rethink what developer tools look like in this age.
I love it. So few comments. So I've been talking about I have this expression, I call it the we are at the product hunt phase of AI. Which means that the people who build things for the product hunt crowd are now also participating in this AI revolution. And then secondly, this whole notion of the intersection is a two-way street. That means the ML teams benefit from all the software engineering rigor that the software engineers may bring to the table. So so what was the timing? So when did you guys start?
We started earlier this year around March. And so it's been, how long has it been? 8-9 months now? Yeah.
So the fundamental thesis is we are entering this phase, this product hunt phase of AI development. And so I think that's more or less been, if anything, reinforced, right? So
absolutely.
We started the company, right? So
you see it at every layer of the stack now as well.
Right. So your underlying assumption remains true. Have you guys made any kind of adjustment in your thinking?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that has surprised us is with any fad, there's always a risk that things will fizzle out and that it may not be as big as the hype suggests it will be. I am even more convinced now that there is a profound shift in computing that we're witnessing. Our relationship with computing devices is going to change. Even my own workflow with GitHub Copilot on how I code, but even like I use ChatGPT all the time as a coding assistant, and just as a helper to explain things, like I would ask a professor. And so just that's a small example, but it points to a profound way that we are interacting with computers that is different from what it used to be. So in that sense, I'm even more convinced now that this is a true revolution happening. And then the follow-up from that, you have to think is, okay, what are the consequences of that statement? And one of them is that you need to be able to build these applications that are powered by AI at scale and reliably. And how do you go from this experimentation phase that AI is in, the product hunt phase that you mentioned, all the way to production-grade applications with reliable safeguards, CI/CD, version control, monitoring, things that we take for granted in the software world that frankly is just completely a wild west right now with generative AI.
Yeah. I just actually put together, I've been looking at generative AI job postings in the US using LinkedIn for the last year. And I put together a slide deck that I posted of all the use cases. So, so these are from job postings. So they are basically along the lines, right? Hey, we're hiring in generative AI. These are the skills we're looking for. And this is what you'll be working on. And I was just surprised by the variety of self-described things. Now, I'm not saying that those are all in production, but those are at least aspirational use cases that people have identified across many industries. And to your point, I think that a lot of the building will probably be done by software engineers. Obviously, the ML and AI teams will be there to support, but let's face it, they are not known for production.
No comment.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
So with that in mind, Sarmad, so I guess there's a whole plethora of tools that need to be built, right? So you recently open sourced a tool called aiconfig, right?
That's
so
right.
First describe what it is, and then tell us why you started there. Of all the places.
Sounds great. Yeah. And maybe in a moment I can even show you what it is because nothing is better than showing for
Sure, yeah. And to our listeners listening on audio, we also have the video version on YouTube.
Yeah. Perfect. So just to describe what this is, our general thesis is that prompts, model generation settings, what models you're using, that kind of defines the generative AI signature of your application. And so that is a configuration of your application, of the generative AI parts of your application. It's really important to actually version control this because that's gonna affect your application behavior down the line. Just like you source control code, these prompts and model generation settings should also be source controlled. The second thing we're noticing is there is an even greater plethora of generative AI models coming out and more model providers than we anticipated when we started LastMile AI. And so a standardized framework that lets you interact with generative AI in your application code without having to wrangle different model providers or figure out different API syntax is really valuable. And so let me just show you what that looks like. We have this tool called aiconfig that enables some of that.
So you have a universal API. So now, are you going into the whole area of orchestration as well?
To some extent, yes. Model routing, for example, or things where you're trying out different models to figure out which one works best for your use case. We think that's really, really valuable.
So now, Sarmad, listeners might say, well, don't we have things like LangChain, Haystack, semantic kernel? Now, many listeners have heard me say that while I like tools like LangChain, I really question whether they're production grade or they're too bloated. They change too fast, right? So Haystack is what
Yeah.
I currently use, but I'm open to AI config.
Well, let me just talk a little bit about that. You touched on a very important point, which is a lot of the tools you mentioned, they've done an amazing job growing the community of developers that have tried generative AI for the very first time. But what we've seen a lot of enterprise customers talk about is they've had to essentially unwind a lot of these frameworks because of unnecessary abstractions in order to actually take a 50-line app that you can try out very quickly into a production grade system that has the controls and customizations that you need for your use case. And that's kind of what our motivation for AI config is this wave, the second wave of tooling and frameworks that is a little less opinionated, but still more flexible, that allows you to integrate into your existing workflow instead of take over your entire workflow. And so I'm sharing my screen for listeners who are not able to see, but basically what you have here is, we call this an AI workbook. And this looks very similar to a Jupyter notebook, except that a Jupyter notebook has a compute kernel where you're running code. And in this case, an AI workbook has an ML kernel where you can connect to any different kind of AI model. It doesn't even have to be an LLM. It can be Stable Diffusion or other modalities. And you can very quickly prototype and see what is going on. So in this case, I'm trying to plan a trip to New York City. So I can ask ChatGPT, tell me 10 fun things to do in New York City. And you can ask the ChatGPT playground to do this, but what you can't do is chain this together in a complex workflow. So in this case, the second cell then tries to generate an itinerary with this parameter, which is essentially like data you can pass into this prompt. And you can say, pass into GPT-4 the output from GPT 3.5. And this is a model chain. This is a complex operation that having a visual interface makes extremely straightforward and intuitive for you to be able to use. And in this case, I'm relatively happy with it. It actually gave me a pretty good itinerary. I live in New York City, so I know that this is not hallucinating certain things. And so now let's say I want to integrate this into my application, right? And this is where AI config comes in. So now that I have this playground, I can iterate very quickly. And once I'm ready, I can download this JSON file called an AI config, which looks very similar to if you open an IPyNB as a Jupyter notebook, it follows a very similar structure. So instead of cells, you have prompts, and each of the prompts contains the input that you're giving the model, as well as the model generation settings on how you're configuring that model's behavior. And now that you have this config, you can actually version control it, you can evaluate, monitor it, and you can connect it to your application code. And that's where you mentioned earlier, our tagline on our website says productionization and experimentation in a single workflow. And this is what we mean here. So here I have this notebook.
So how do you take this config and how do you actually run it?
Excellent question. So I'm just about to show you here. You just say config.load. You specify the config you want to use, and then you just do config.run. And in this case, I'm referencing the get activities prompt, which was the first prompt I had, which says, tell me 10 fun things to do in New York City. And it calls GPT 3.5 Turbo. You'll notice a few things. One is I didn't have to wrangle with the OpenAI API at all. That's all abstracted away with the AI config. And because it's open source, you can add your own extensions to it for any model provider, and even custom endpoints if you're hosting a model yourself. And the second thing you'll notice is streaming just worked out of the box. And for anyone who's actually played with the OpenAI API, you'll notice that like streaming is not that trivial to set up nicely. You have to write a bunch of boilerplate code around it. And the second thing I wanted to show is this idea of model chaining. So the second prompt that we had, which is a GPT-4 prompt, is taking in the output from the previous prompt and using that as the input into this prompt. And in order to call this prompt chain, all I have to do is set run with dependencies to true, and I just do config.run that gen itinerary, that second prompt here. And what it's doing is this model chain across two different models with two different prompts, but with a simple API call. And if I move back to my workbook here and I had switched this to Llama or Google's Palm, or tomorrow they're going to release Gemini, I could get a new AI config, but my application code would stay exactly the same. I would still be doing config.run, and I wouldn't have to figure out these different API providers or different models, and all that complexity is hidden from your application code. The last thing I wanted to point out is you can also do monitoring with this. So you have these callback managers, which allow you to see exactly what data you're passing into the prompts and how they're being invoked. So in this case, how is OpenAI being invoked? And you can hook this up to Datadog or how you do monitoring and observability. You can also run evals on this, so you can measure the quality of the AI config. And so there are a lot of benefits that you get by having a dedicated generative AI artifact for the generative AI parts of your application. And so now we're starting to get to the second wave of software engineering practices built in, where you have version control, you have monitoring, you have observability as this first-class principle of generative AI application development.
Yeah. So, few things. So I like the fact that it's great for experimentation, because that's basically why some of these frameworks became popular, like LangChain, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's very easy for non-experts to play around with LLMs. So, couple of questions. One is you showed chaining,
Yeah.
but it seems like that's becoming one of the simpler patterns. So other
Right.
patterns that are emerging are like this mixture of experts, where
Yes.
you have a classifier that routes to the right LLM. Are you able to support more complicated directed acyclic graphs?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I wanted to touch on one thing before I answer that question, which is one of the side effects we're noticing of having this generative AI artifact is the application development is now becoming more collaborative. So you can have one person who is doing the prompt engineering and experimentation. They create this AI config that can be version controlled, and then another person who's doing the web development or the application development, and they can integrate this AI config for the end-to-end application. And so now you have multiple people, and that's what a software engineering team does usually. You have different roles in your team. In terms of routing is a very important thing. We've thought about it quite a bit. There's actually a cookbook already on the AI config GitHub repo for how to do model routing. Mixture of experts, that's one layer down on the model architecture layer. But one thing we've been thinking about actually is the mixture of experts has a network router that is trained as a model itself. And we've been thinking, can we actually take that piece of how it routes things to the different neural layers inside the model and actually use it as an LLM router? So move it one layer above, where this router, given a query, can figure out which is the best LLM to route your query to. We're actually seeing production applications for that, where not everybody is at that phase yet, but some early adopters, they're trying to reduce cost, right? And so they're like, can I have this prompt, which doesn't need GPT-4, be handled by Llama 2 instead? And so that is a model router that they want to implement that's optimized on a cost function, or the maxima of like cost and usefulness of the quality of the result. And so we're seeing these different kinds of approaches take shape. The nice thing is with AI config, at least you have different prompts and model parameters, all version controlled. And then the routing layer can actually be a layer on top of the configs themselves. And that could be the mixture of expert style that you mentioned, or it could be this cost optimization function that I mentioned. It could be many different styles of routing.
So just to clarify, so everything we've talked about is open source?
It is all open source, and you can actually add your own extensions for AI config. What we're really trying to do is make AI config a first-class citizen of this generative AI workflow that we're talking about. And then the products that we build will be products that use AI config as an artifact. But everything we're talking about is all open source, and you can try it all out today.
So second point, as you know, one of the more popular kind of the hello world example in this space right now is retrieval augmented generation,
Yes.
which, you've got the actual application once you've built it, but then there's a whole building the RAG system in a principled way. And what do I mean by that? I think listeners have heard me talk about this. First you choose what data you're going to use, then you choose your information extraction strategy, right? So if it's a bunch of PDF files, which PDF extraction tool should I use? Or if it's scanned, which OCR library should I use? If it's a web page, which crawler? After that, what's the chunking strategy?
Yeah.
And then after that, what's the embedding? And then only after that can you actually start playing around with the RAG system. So do
Yeah.
you guys cover that whole pipeline before RAG? I mean, the whole, the data pipeline.
Yeah.
So in other words, when you're doing RAG in a principled way, there's a lot of knobs you have to turn
Yes.
in order to tune it, right? So right now, it seems like from what I've seen, it's all LLMs, right?
It's a great question. So we have a separate project actually called Semantic Retrieval. We haven't announced it yet, but it is open source, and so it is on our GitHub already. What you're pointing out is essentially generative AI introduces a new kind of ETL workflow where it is still ETL, where I'm extracting data, I'm transforming it in some way, and I'm loading it into some kind of vector store or index layer.
And Sarmad, it's deceptive because if
Yeah.
you just do RAG out of the box in a dumb way, you will get some reasonable results. It's
Yeah.
only when you actually know the underlying data sources really well that you realize you might be missing a lot of things
Absolutely.
unless you tune it, right? So
And exactly. And it's not even just the quality that is like a prerequisite, but even things that we take for granted in software systems like role-based access control, those things are not propagated in RAG today. So you have data from your Google Drive that all documents are not created equal. They have access policies, but when you ingest it, they lose all that context. And then when you index it, those embeddings have no idea about any of the access policies. And so that's a huge security flaw, right? Like that will never work in production. And so what we are trying to do with semantic retrieval is we have built role-based access control through the entire pipeline. So there's a separate metadata database that lets you actually track what document, every part of this, and also not just what document everything came from, but also what's the access policy associated with it. And the final part is evaluation, which you're pointing out, which is how do I actually measure the quality of my end-to-end pipeline? And that may be dependent on what use case I'm using this for, but you still need evaluation as a prerequisite to shipping something in production. And so that's not a solved problem fully yet. I think the best case people have is letting developers define their own eval functions.
yeah. I mean, so and you can do eval end to end or component wise, right? Because
Exactly.
the retrieval part, retrieval and ranking has its own eval, right? So
Exactly.
and then once you do the retrieval and ranking, can you produce the right answer? Even if I give you
Right.
the right things to
Yeah.
base your answer on, can you actually produce a good answer, right? So
A small example of that is, let's say you retrieve things from the vector database, and then you pass it into an LLM to generate a paragraph, right? You want to validate that the LLM didn't lose information in that process. So that is in itself an eval step. And that is like the LLM, anything that interfaces with the LLM, we think should be part of an AI config so that you can evaluate that separately. And then there's the end-to-end eval of the pipeline itself on, is this data being transformed in the right ways, or is the overall retrieval quality to my standards? For there's Jacquard similarity and a couple of other metrics that people use. But you're pointing out exactly the right things, that eval is not this monolithic thing. It has to be broken down into specific things and then you aggregate the results to understand the overall quality.
So your target audience for the tools you're building are non-ML or non-AI experts, right? So then
Exactly.
how do you so do you make the assumption that okay, so these folks are going to build generative AI applications without any ML or AI people involved? Because at some level that's fine because it's doable, but then
Right.
maybe they don't know the right way to evaluate these things. So what's
Yeah.
your position on the staffing
Yeah.
of teams moving forward?
It's a very good question because first, there is no clear answer to this yet. People are still early in this journey. What our take is, you can never hire enough ML researchers to augment enough software engineers.
They're expensive and they can't.
There aren't enough of them either.
They can't write production code.
So exactly, and so what we'll see, I think, is this stack of responsibilities that is going to be built up. Enterprises that we work with, what they're doing is they are setting up these centralized platform layers where they do have some ML engineers and data scientists, and this is where they do cost tracking or inference or evaluation. But then they expose those endpoints as services, and then software engineers can reliably build products on that. Now, the workflow is still undefined. These are like aspirational central platform services, but that's the architectural, organizational architecture that companies are going towards. And these are fairly sophisticated companies like financial institutions that have already done ML for a number of years. If you are a company that has never even had an ML function, it's very hard to imagine how you would staff that up just to get something out into production. And the bet we're making is that software engineers are going to be at the forefront of AI application development. And even if they're going to need those kinds of quality, reliable workflows to be able to get their jobs done, even in next year onwards. This is not a far out kind of proposition we're talking about.
So it's interesting because one thing I've learned using many of these things is that I think if you are allowed to use an endpoint, because basically while some of the models are quote unquote small, they're still 7 billion parameters. So very few teams are actually have the expertise to deploy that at scale efficiently, right? So if you look at companies like Anyscale and Databricks, in full disclosure, I'm an advisor to both. There's a lot of IP in terms of how do you do inference and deployment at scale, so that it's performant and you're not losing money every time someone asks a question. So I think if you are allowed to use an endpoint, number one. Number two, always prototype with one of the proprietary models like ChatGPT or GPT-4 or Claude, because I think to some extent, I guess a good rule of thumb is that if you can't get it done there, it's unlikely the open source models will get you there. Now you can say, well, I can fine tune the hell out of the open source models. Maybe that's possible. But I think that many teams, I think, underestimate so the open source models are cool. I actually use mostly now for inference the open source models, but I'm not even attempting to deploy this myself, right? So what's your take on so because I think most teams may not have the staffing to actually do all of these themselves, right? So
and even like inference, for example, you can do slow inference, but to do it properly, it's a very complex kind of system. And even infrastructure wise, it's not trivial. So what we're seeing actually is exactly what you described. A lot of people start with GPT-4 because it's the current state of the art proprietary model. And then they get it they get their prototype in a good enough state where they're happy with the performance and results. But then before they can deploy it, it's cost prohibitive for the scale of hundreds of thousands of requests.
Or latency, honestly.
Or latency. And so they want to switch to a fine-tuned version of Llama 2 or something that does that specific task really well. Most teams, I think, at this point, and especially software engineers right now, are probably not equipped with the tools to be able to fine-tune themselves. I still think there's going to be an element of ML engineering required or data science required in the fine-tuning phase. But that's where I think some of the separation
I have an answer for that.
Oh, please.
which is basically just go to the Anyscale endpoints.
Right.
Because basically there, the service is so easy to use, you end up focusing on your fine-tuning data set.
Yeah.
So basically you focus on your fine-tuning data set, which depending on the task, a couple of thousand examples. I've fine-tuned models with 500 to 600 examples. And by that, for our listeners, that means basically kind of like the workflow for supervised learning, except now you have the labeled data is prompt, desired response, prompt, desired response. You have a couple of thousand of those, and then you kick off the fine-tuning task. You get an email. Here's your endpoint. Boom, you're done.
you're done. Exactly.
So all you do, so really what you need to bring to the table is your domain expertise.
That's right. And so I think the evaluating the quality of the fine-tuned model, how to do data extraction and which data to use for this fine-tuning, I think that still requires a fair amount of expertise to debug when, like, if it works, that's amazing. But when you need to debug what's going on, it's non-trivial. So I think there's some element of data science still involved there, but you're absolutely right that infrastructure companies, Anyscale included, are providing these really nice services to be able to run those jobs in an efficient way. And then at the AI config layer, what we have is these model parsers, we call them, which is essentially any API endpoint that hosts inference, as long as you know how to run that inference, can be hooked into an AI config. So then in order to switch from GPT-4 to an Anyscale hosted fine-tuned llama, it's just switching the model parser for that prompt, and that's it. And the prompt engineering and all that stuff that you've done, you can continue to experiment with it, but you don't have to change it unless you really need to. And so hopefully over time, what this creates is this ecosystem of model providers and inference endpoints and developer frameworks that let you interface with those in a reliable way.
So you described AI config, which is a tool that covers both the exploration, experimentation, and then once you have your pipeline of LLM calls, then you can deploy to production. Then you described a not yet announced tool for retrieval augmented generation. What's it called again?
It's called semantic retrieval. So semantic being the understanding part of it.
Yeah, semantic retrieval. So what's the status of semantic retrieval?
It works. It's on GitHub. We just haven't done any marketing to promote it yet. The reason it's open source is we're working with a couple of enterprises to deploy that at enterprise scale, and it's meant to scale to the tune of billions of documents. And so we're just not going. We still committed to open source, and that's why it's open source. But we started working with enterprises to deploy it first.
I guess a key question, Sarmad, for open source when people ask about status that includes documentation.
That includes documentation.
So how is the documentation for
AI config? You can go to aiconfig.lastmileai.dev, and we have very extensive documentation on the extensibility, on what's supported. We even have videos, which is
what about the other tool?
Semantic retrieval has a README right now and internal documentation, so that's why it's not been released yet.
Yeah. So these are two pieces. So what else are you focused? So I guess is your mindset, let's just focus on these two for now. Let's nail this down before we do something else, or
yeah, I think for us right now, AI config as the thing that bridges that inner dev loop that you have between prototyping, experimentation, and productionization is super important, because everybody's in that phase in some way right now and will be for a long time. We have to really get that right. How you connect your data to LLMs in a safe and systematic way, that's essentially what semantic retrieval is. That's also very important. But I actually have an opinion where I don't think RAG is going to be the only game in town going forward. I think we'll come up with better techniques for how we do retrieval. And so we want to be at the forefront of how companies connect their enterprise data to LLMs. Today, that is RAG, but that will change over time. And I think we'll have more hybrid techniques in the near future. And then the final piece of that is the thing I alluded to around monitoring, observability, and feeding the data back into your inner loop. That's the outer loop of your developer workflow. Now that you have things in production, you have CI/CD pipelines, and that you have monitoring and observability hooked up, I want to have a continuous improvement cycle. Some of that may go into fine-tuning my own models down the line, but even just improving prompts or understanding how are my users interacting with my AI applications, which are non-deterministic by design. That is a tricky thing to do. And so we want to hook into existing observability platforms that already do this really well. We think that creating a parallel universe of GenAI developer tools is not as useful as bringing those tools into your existing inner dev loop as it exists for as a software engineer today.
So earlier I asked you about orchestration, which is
Yeah.
which is a loaded term. Some of these tools call themselves orchestration, but if you go to the software engineering teams,
Yeah.
software orchestration to them means a few things. One, you have an executor, you
Right.
have the scheduler, you have a metadata store, and you have monitoring, right? So,
Right.
are you guys going to be an orchestration tool?
Unclear, to be quite honest.
Mhm.
It depends on, I think for us, we're an early stage startup. And so for us, the real value is really embedding ourselves deeply in a developer workflow in a way that is actually valuable to the developers. It can't be just for the sake of embedding ourselves into something. So when you talk about orchestration, you're right, it's an overloaded term. Scheduling, execution, all of those that are services, I think there are a couple of tools out there that are trying to build these managed services for you to do some of this. I actually think there are companies have great infra engineers. Some of them already have great infrastructure. And sometimes there is not a need to create a parallel kind of thing just for Gen AI. Scheduling can just be your existing scheduling or workflow orchestration engine. On the other hand, there are pieces of it that are truly tied to Gen AI. So for example, version controlling your configs or dynamically hot swapping them as your app in live in production, or evaluation that is custom to Gen AI. Those pieces are Gen AI specific, and we will go into those pieces specifically. But we're really careful about thinking of what are the things that are actually net new versus what are the things that already are solved problems for software engineers that we shouldn't just reinvent for the sake of reinventing it for Gen AI. An example for that is actually ETL pipelines. They have existed for a long time. It's just that now the data in part is unstructured in PDFs, and then you transform it and chunk it, but it is ETL. And so I think there are already great orchestration tools out there for these kinds of things that we would actually encourage people to leverage.
So actually, so honestly, so I think that not enough people are working on the ETL aspect of this
Yeah.
thing, right? So because if you look back 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was a whole set of startups, data engineering startups focused on ETL, ELT, mostly for data that lands in a data lakehouse or data warehouse, right?
Right.
So, but for some reason, for this Gen AI data, no one seems to be that focused on this problem for some reason.
Yeah.
Everyone, we have so many of these vector database startups, which
Yeah.
in my mind is unclear because basically
Yeah.
they're one-trick ponies and their tricks are being included in existing systems like Postgres, right? So
Yes.
or MongoDB. So, but on the other hand, the ETL stuff and data quality stuff, I mean, that's basically fundamental to all these applications, but we don't have that many startups in that area.
I think you're right. And so that is what I mean, where I think a lot of people are focusing on the commoditized pieces that some of which already exist, like how you do ETL. There's Airflow, there's Temporal. That's already super battle-tested tools. But then what you're feeding in, how you're transforming
Like I said earlier, that information extraction step, if you can get that really right, you
Exactly.
get the maximum value from your data, right?
And I think the short answer to your question is it's just early, right? So people are just doing basic chunking with sliding window for creating embeddings. They're using OpenAI embeddings, like fine-tuning embedding models. That's one area that I think can even people should look into. It's very expensive otherwise. The other is like, how do you re-ingest data as an actual pipeline as it gets changed? That is important for production as well. And then I agree with you. I think there are a lot of layers that are quickly becoming commoditized. I think vector databases specifically are going to be one of many kinds of indexes that you're going to need. We've actually talked to folks who've done research on this, and the best combination for indexing is actually BM25, so lexical search, plus vector search.
Yeah.
Vector search by itself
Hybrid,
is the worst performing one. Yeah, hybrid is the best.
yeah.
And I think even like Pinecone and a few other providers are switching by default to be hybrid retrieval from their vector DBs. So I think we'll see more consolidation at that layer, but you're right that how data is actually, what data is being used, how it's getting transformed, more interesting strategies on combining different chunks, all of those things will come in the next year or so.
And obviously, another aspect to this is risk mitigation, and
Right.
having a tool like aiconfig where you can version control things will help you diagnose problems, and maybe if there is a problem. I mean, you came from Facebook, you know that when a machine learning model breaks, most of the time it's for some freaking data pipeline. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So mean time to recovery is important, and having
Yeah.
the right tools that can lower that mean time to recovery is key. But now there are special things in the space. I recently wrote an overview on this topic of prompt injection.
Right.
So a lot of things that might be special, but there are things that are common to
Yeah.
problems that software engineers have faced before. So, yeah. So how do you have a position on how you do things like I don't know, unit testing, integration testing? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it starts with doing the basics right? Like I think we're everybody's so excited by this technology, and we're trying to like get ahead of the curve here. But if we really think about it, version control of your prompts and model settings and all of those things, super baseline stuff that should be a like
Done.
no-brainer.
Yeah.
And then once you have this as a version controlled artifact, every time you check this into your source control, there should be a CI/CD run that runs evals, which is, I think, the GenAI equivalent of unit and integration tests. And those can be like with hard-coded data or a specific eval kind of metrics that you care about. And those should run on a recurring basis. Every time you make a change, it affects that. And the final thing is triggers on application behavior as it's deployed in the wild, which is more on the monitoring side. So for example, Facebook came out with a fine-tuned version of Llama called Llama Guard, I think late last week. And we did a quick use of it in aiconfig, where basically what Llama Guard allows you to do is classify conversations between humans as prompts and AI as agents, as whether they're being unsafe or safe. So whether, if you ask ChatGPT for something on how to sell an illegal thing on Facebook Marketplace or Amazon or something, there should be some safeguards in place. And so if the model responds in an unsafe way, this Llama Guard model allows you to classify it. And so that layer of classifying conversations could actually be done in your outer loop, in your monitoring, where you have data pipelines that are looking at transcripts of your chatbot, for example, and classifying conversations as safe and unsafe based on custom policies, even of like what you care about as a company or a brand. Those kinds of things, and those can trigger warnings and alerts, and then your on-call gets messaged, and that can go back into like looking at your aiconfig, debugging changes, and that's truly a software developer workflow at that point. And we're used to that as a workflow. It's just that GenAI is this new concept without any of the tooling around it. So it's very hard to extricate it from your application code today. And it's very hard to build these reliable processes. But I think you'll see, even in the next couple of months, you will have a more reliable kind of software engineering workflow for generative AI.
So, Sarmad, if you look at, for example, the tools that you folks use in Facebook, as you mentioned, Facebook has, I think, millions and millions of models running around in production, right? So at some point, this generative AI, there will be lots and lots of LLMs or fine-tuned LLMs and so on and so forth running around an enterprise. So is anyone thinking about model governance and things like that? So what are the tools? So do we just use the tools that you folks were using for traditional ML? Do they map over for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think predictive ML had a few things that we can definitely take over. The thing that worries me, to be quite honest, is unless there is a new kind of re-education of engineers building with this really powerful foundational technology, we'll fall into this trap of having unsafe applications that are powered by generative AI. And so part of that is also just what is that adding this new lexicon and set of processes for responsible AI and AI governance in. I think it starts small. It starts with things like version control, but then it goes it goes beyond that progressively over time. And so I think model governance means also, a small example is OpenAI created a seed setting for their models recently, where if you set seed to, I think, 0, it will deterministically return the same response every time. That is an example where in some cases you want that. And so that is, to me, a small example of governance. The other part is different AI models working together in a complex pipeline. How you do governance for that, I think, also requires a bit of transparency on what's happening underneath the covers. There are, Hugging Face, for example, has model cards which describe the behavior of that model. I think we'll need something similar for generative AI as well, and not just a single model, but actually the AI, generative AI application, the series of things that are being run in the pipeline in order to generate a response. So I think it's an unsolved problem, to be quite honest. The way Facebook did it, I think there was quite a few model cards which were descriptors of what these models did. There was also a lot of model tracking and management where, similar to NPM, right? Like you have these GitHub, these JavaScript packages. Similarly, you can have a repository of ML models and descriptors on what they do, even stats on specific evals that they have passed or failed, and compare them across each other. And then you need this tooling and for experimentation for the engineers to figure out how do you promote different versions of these to production. That doesn't exist yet, but I think that is an open problem that is very important for us to solve.
Yeah. By the way, when I talked to my friends at Luminous.law, the first law firm focused on AI risks, and I'm an advisor as well. And they actually they work with the chief legal counsels of just about every team that produces these foundation models, right? So whenever I ask them, so what is the one piece of advice you can give to AI teams? They always say, improve your documentation.
Yeah.
Right. So step one, you got to do that. And so, and actually, I created this kind of little shortcut or tool where I looked at that letter that the FTC sent to OpenAI. Inside this letter is 17 pages of questions. So I created kind of this mind map where you can, if you can answer as many of these questions as possible, then you're in good shape,
Absolutely.
as a team, right? So.
Exactly. And I think what you're alluding to is it's not just a technical challenge, there's an organizational and process challenge as well. And it starts with re-education of software engineers and people building with generative AI. But we do need to evolve a little bit on our existing processes to make room for generative AI.
So in closing, Sarmad, so I want to have you tell us what's your sense of the mood of developers, right? So obviously there's a lot of excitement, right, around this stuff. But I imagine there's also a bit of frustration because now you have every executive, every manager, every CXO. They open the CEO opens the paper, reads about a new model, and hounds the tech people. How come we're not using it? So there's a bit of excitement and frustration. Am I right? Or what's your sense?
I was gonna choose the word frustration as well. I think it boils down to this. So you have these generative AI models, and everyone can see how magical they are. Like I'm still amazed at how incredible using GPT-4 is for coding help, for just like trip planning, whatever it is. And so it seems like it's so easy, to just use it in production and call it a day.
Why can't we use this for our supply chain?
Exactly. Or why can't I use it for my health stuff, right? Like, or whatever it is. And the challenge is that last mile problem. That's why we named ourselves LastMile AI, because that step from prompt engineering and like seeing this model that I can call with an API to actually deploying it in production, there's so many complex nuances in between. And a lot of people get frustrated because I think the expectation of even their own expectation of how easy it would be to productionize is very high right now, because so many people are promising so many things, and also these models themselves are just so impressive. And so I think people do need to take a step back and just to really make sure that we do this responsibly, reliably, and do it properly. And I think we are also getting to that next wave of maturity of the developer frameworks and tools themselves that enables them to actually move faster and still reliably in this coming wave of generative AI. So I think to just summarize, I think the foundational shift in computing is definitely there. I'm convinced that software engineers, even with the frustration, will really commit time and resources and energy to building applications. But I think it will actually get easier in the next couple of months to be able to do that reliably.
Yeah, I think also, I think this is also maybe an opportunity for software teams to rise to the occasion by, developing some basic material or course for their executives, where they can hear out what the executives are super excited about these things,
Yeah.
but point out, here are some of the things that we need to do in order to do this right. But we're with you. We are
Yes.
we are going to do it. But just so you know that it's not as simple as writing a prompt into GPT-4.
Absolutely. And I think it will, that realization is starting to dawn. And the good news is, at least from the customers we are working with, there is that buy-in from both sides on the senior executive level of really investing in building these platforms, and also on the engineers on doing it the right way. And then the rest is just, we get to work and we work hard, and we'll ship things in production.
And with that, thank you, Sarmad.
Thank you so much, Ben.